Good afternoon, everyone. If you could just take your seats. Thank you very much. My name is Jacqueline Coutier. I'm the Director of Public Relations here at the Institute, for those who do not know me. So it's my pleasure today to introduce our speaker at today's lunch briefing. His name is Vinh-Kim Nguyen. We've been practicing before. Apparently there's a YouTube video if you're not quite sure how to pronounce his name, which was my case. So he is a fellow Canadian, among other things, professor of anthropology and sociology here at the Institute for, I guess, 3 years now. He's also a clinical professor at the School of Public Health at the University of Montreal, and he holds an ERC grant on science and politics of a world without AIDS and heads a team of anthropologists researching the Ebola epidemic in West Africa. But in addition to his academic work, Vinh-Kim is an HIV and emergency physician at the Jewish General Hospital in Montreal, one of the best hospitals in Montreal, trust my experience. And he conducts humanitarian missions with Médecins Sans Frontières, where he was just elected on the board. Vinh-Kim never sleeps. So this is why we're very fortunate to have him speak on the subject of the relation between new wars and new epidemics in light of his recent experiences in the DRC, in Yemen, and West Africa. I should also mention that Vinh-Kim is taking the role of director of our Global Health Center in the fall, succeeding Ilona Kickbush. As all of our lunch briefing, this event will last an hour, and I will close at 1:30 with Vinh-Kim making a presentation of no longer than 30 minutes. There will be a Q&A with the floor afterwards. Enjoy the talk. Vinh-Kim, floor is yours.
So thank you, Jacqueline, for that introduction. I'm actually quite a sleep fanatic, and I'm able to sleep because I have so many wonderful colleagues, including our team here at the Global Health Center and at the Institute. So first of all, I'm just going to start here. Oh, right, don't press the black button. Of course I pressed the black button. All right, so what I wanted to present to you today in about 30 minutes is I wanted to present to you some findings and some hypotheses regarding the relationship between our current geopolitical situation, which some social scientists and journalists have called the forever war, and a number of epidemiological phenomena. So specifically, what I'm talking about here is the coincidence, and I'm not claiming causality here, between the succession of wars that have succeeded the September 11th attacks, which, as you know, have raged across large swaths of the globe. So the connection between this geopolitical instability and two apparently unrelated epidemics. The first one is antimicrobial resistance, and the second one are Ebola epidemics. So antibiotic resistance, as we know, is a very worrisome phenomenon because it threatens to reverse 50 years of biomedical progress. Without effective antibiotics, which is what antimicrobial resistance may eventually lead to in 10 to 15 years, without effective antibiotics, surgery and chemotherapy will no longer be able to be done safely. So people will die of fairly routine conditions we treat fairly routinely. Antibiotic resistance has really increased dramatically since 2001. And since 2014, we've been hit with now 2 major Ebola epidemics. So there's been a worrisome transformation in Ebola from sporadic, rural, easily contained epidemics to sustained and urban epidemics. So what might be the linkages between geopolitical instability today and epidemics? Don't press the black button. So I'll start my story with a very curious organism which was baptized rather inaccurately by US military surgeons, Iraqi Bacter. Iraqi Bacter, which is the moniker they developed for a bacteria whose real name is Acinetobacter baumannii, is a bacteria which started to appear in patients, in wounded soldiers returning from Iraq. It started within a few weeks of the invasion of Iraq. Iraqi Bacter refers to the multi-drug resistant form of Baumannii or Acinetobacter, and therefore it was termed a superbug. Now, the reason this very rare and strange bacteria started to cause concern starting after 2006 and 2008 is that it very clearly spread out of the US military population into the civilian population. It's found all over the world now. It is, I'm sure, present at HUG. At the hospital I work at in Montreal, we had an outbreak several years ago that we published on that killed 6 people. So we really have something that apparently started with the Iraq invasion and has spread around the world. So that's an important part of it. That's an interesting fact, and I'm going to show you why we should worry about this otherwise rare and unknown bacteria that I'm sure none of you have ever heard of. So Acinetobacter, for those of you who know their Latin, means motionless. And it's a very interesting bacteria. This is an electron micrograph of the bacteria. And what this bacteria does very well is being lazy. It's a very fat, lazy couch potato of a bacteria. And what it does exceptionally well is it just hangs around. It clings to surfaces. And it has another property which is very interesting, is that when it senses other bacteria around, it does what you and I would do, is it starts secreting a slime. And that slime is what you see there. The polite term for it is a biofilm. And that slime allows it to then engage in bacterial sex. I'm sure you didn't think you would be hearing about slimy sex at this talk. But it allows it to engage in bacterial sex in the sense that it exchanges genes with other bacteria. These biofilms form importantly in wounds and on prostheses, like when you put in a rod for a fracture. So what it does then, remember I said it was fat and lazy, what it does is it then it secretes the slime, it acquires the genes, and it hoards them. That's what makes it fat. Fat is in a metaphoric sense. It's laden down with genetic baggage. Now, this is very important because it's usually not useful for a bacteria to carry around all that luggage, right? You and I don't go around town carrying a lot of luggage, but we do if we think we're going away somewhere. And so Acinetobacter is, in fact, most of the time hindered by this. It can't do much. And it's overgrown, or it's outcompeted by slimmer, more nimble bacteria that have fewer genes. But you can imagine that in certain settings, a bacteria that's fat with lots of accumulated genes may have an advantage. It may have an advantage over other bacteria. And that is what bacteria do, is they are constantly fighting for territorial survival, whether it's in the soil, your kitchen sink, on your skin, in your gut, or in a hospital. So in a hospital, obviously, there's a lot of antibiotics floating around. And increasingly, we now know in degraded environments like those destroyed by warfare. So sliming, accumulating, and hoarding are Iraqi Bacter's strategies in the endless war that bacteria wage around each other. So how does this all come together? Well, remember I said antibiotic resistance is a genetic phenomenon. And, sorry, I think my slides are a bit in the wrong order, but let me just go forward. Bacterial warfare. Okay, so what are the implications? I mentioned before that certain bacteria will acquire genes to withstand antibiotic attacks, and you can see this on this slide. These are slides of bacteria. The white are bacterial colonies or isolates, and as they are grown with antibiotics, only some survive. So the antibiotic resistance that we're most worried about today is called, forgive the technical term, Carbapenem Resistance. So carbapenems are the latest generation, if you will, of post-penicillins. Trade names or generic names, scientific names include imipenem, meropenem, ertapenem. So these are our last resort antibiotics, particularly for gram-negative bacteria. technical issue that's not that important here. Now, we know for bacteria to acquire, so carbapenems are not found in nature. Bacteria naturally secrete antibiotics to attack each other and gain territorial advantage, and they naturally will acquire antibiotic resistance to defend themselves. But the level of antibiotic resistance in nature is minuscule compared, because the quantities of antibiotics that are released by bacteria are very, very small compared to what we're doing. So that has been a game changer for antibiotic resistance. Carbapenems are not normally found in nature, and carbapenem resistance is human-made. And for bacteria by the time bacteria acquire carbapenem resistance, they are resistant to everything else. So all you need to remember from this technical discussion is that if a bacteria is resistant to carbapenem antibiotics, which is our last line of antibiotics, it's resistant to everything else. So how does this form of resistance arise? Well, what happens is that the bacteria that have mutations that have genes that allow them to survive, carbapenems, that survive, as you saw in that previous slide, they actually do something very curious, which is that over millions of generations, those antibiotic genes migrate out of the bacterial genome and get packaged into these little plasmids, right? So you have these floating genes that go around. And this is how, remember I was talking about how Acinetobacter exchanges genes. So these are the things that float between, one of the mechanisms by which bacteria can transfer genes to each other. And that's another picture of, so what we found here, this is a little bit of scientific detail. This is a paper that came out, I think, 3 years ago. And this is just an example of what this shows basically is that these bacteria manufacture these plasmids, and what they do is they take bits of genes that they find in the environment and they package them with promoter sequence that enhance their expression or their virulence. So basically what you see here is that bacteria are antibiotic factories, right? So what happens here is that plasmids are turned into sophisticated genetic warheads. And this is what Acinetobacter is very good at doing. Now, if we look at, if we go back again to this carbapenem resistance, it's something that occurs in hospitals. Ordinary bacteria don't develop resistance to ordinary antibiotics because they're healthy people that get them, and they often clear infections on their own. But in the last 10 years, we've observed a marked increase in hospitals worldwide of carbapenem resistance. And what I want to show here, this is just a slide from when I was in Yemen last year or 2 years ago of a mass casualty event, right? So in a war setting, but not even necessarily, when you have many, many patients come in there, you have to put them on the floor, there's no infection control going on. And that's just one of the ways in which bacteria can spread easily in hospitals, particularly in wartime. Not to mention degraded hospitals, poor infection control, et cetera, et cetera. I'm sure you've seen pictures of the underground hospitals in Syria. Now, what this slide shows, and I won't go into detail, is that NDM, the middle one, has in the past few years outstripped all the other carbapenem resistance genes. And what we have found, which is very worrisome, is that it appears that NDM originates in Acinetobacter baumannii. So what that suggests, I'm putting a lot of things together here, is that in the conditions of, and that Acinetobacter, even though it's the infections it causes in humans are the tip of the iceberg. Below the surface, there is an environmental reservoir where this bacteria is producing these genetic warheads and exporting them to other bacteria that cause infections in humans. So if we just go back to this slide, so what we have here is what I would call a perfect storm, right? You have the combination of healthcare, so we have massive and sustained destruction of the built environment, shrapnel, and so on. So when you have this kind of destruction, it produces very particular kinds of wounds that get infected easily. Because there's a lot of inoculation, and because, regrettably, weapons, ordnance are being designed deliberately to maim and to infect. So this is the story of barrel bombs in Syria with wires and feces and so on. Another example is the use of heavy metals, for example, in depleted uranium in Fallujah, white phosphorus in Gaza. There's a lot of examples. So we've got two things going on here in terms of the wounding. We've got the kind of ordnance, and we've got the environment in which, if a bomb goes off in Geneva, it's going to cause less infections than the same bomb in an already destroyed city. And I think you can imagine why. So the perfect storm involves the destruction of the built environment, the kind of explosive devices that have been generated, the huge numbers of wounded who congregate in improvised health facilities that use patchy and that where antibiotic use is inconsistent, and often you have substandard antibiotics. I'll just show you a picture here of. So this was the ward in Hammer where I was, and we would do rounds every day. The bulk of the patients are surgical patients. The bulk of them have infections. Patients are 2 to a bed, which is cozy but not great for, and they share everything like shoes and hair clippers and so on. And this is an example of one patient who had been on, I think came in with at least 7 different kinds of antibiotics, which is a recipe for antibiotic resistance. None of them, as you can see, are brand name. This is Yemen, so who knows how they're getting in and where they're coming from. The thing that we forget often is that these conflicts are occurring in the Middle East, where we have a highly educated population and previously very sophisticated health systems. So this is a population that's very literate, medically speaking. They want antibiotics. They know they work, and they'll pay for them. They have money. This is not DRC, which we'll talk about in a second, where there's no money to go around. So this is kind of creates what some commentators have called antibiotic anarchy, and this is the perfect storm I'm talking about. So if we want to resume that perfect storm, what we have is healthcare systems damaged by warfare, growing civilian casualties, generating antibiotic resistance, but then, importantly, that resistance spread as a genetic phenomena. It's spread by patients fleeing combat and seeking treatment. And that, as those genes spread out into the microbial environments in hospitals and beyond, they transform microbial genes all around the world. This sounds a little science fiction-y, but this is what we're seeing now. And a fascinating story that one of my colleagues, who I'll thank later, discovered, is that we can actually trace back one kind of resistance gene, which is now found in all bacteria around the world, to a single event in World War II. So we know this has happened before, but it's happening now on a scale and an intensity with an intensity that's unprecedented. So now we'll shift gears a bit in the few minutes I have remaining and talk about Ebola and violence in the DRC. We all know this is the second biggest epidemic which has occurred since the West African epidemic, and it has been marked by significant violence that I'll talk about in a second. It's probably worth me taking just a minute to explain, because I want you to understand what's causing the violence here. So we have so in terms of the context, we have an area where the authority of the central state is quite weak. Kinshasa is thousands of kilometers away. Violence is endemic. Literally hundreds of armed groups vie for control over small territories, more for economic gain than any kind of coherent ethnic or political ideology. Massacres are legion and kill thousands a year, kill far more than Ebola, and they've displaced hundreds of thousands. So we're in an area which, although it is physically an absolutely beautiful area, is prone to chronic endemic conflict. In that setting, we have a healthcare infrastructure which is weak. So this is a picture of one of the wards at the hospital we worked at. So it actually looks kind of nice there, but it's not. This ward was actually infested with bed bugs, et cetera, et cetera. So health conditions are weak, and the healthcare infrastructure is weak, and people are in very poor health. We have very high mortality from the usual killers, malaria, typhoid, et cetera. These are daily killers. These kill children and adults alike every day in these hospitals. So in that setting, Ebola comes along, and there's a big drama, shall we say. I don't want to minimize deaths from Ebola, but in this context, for people there, it's just a passing thing, which does not seem as real as many of the difficulties people struggle with on a daily basis. The response has been very robust, very muscular, shall we say. And this is a credit to WHO, its ability to have a sustained operation. This is new. WHO is not used to running programs in the field, so this is quite impressive. And I really don't want to come across, and not because I'm at the Graduate Institute, I don't want to come across as criticizing WHO. I think that we really have to credit the organization, which was very strongly critiqued in 2014 for not doing enough. And I'm not trying to say they're doing too much, okay? So it may sound a bit like that, but what's happened is that the way this operational response has played out in the field has led to unfortunate and inadvertently perverse consequences. And this is part of learning to, we need to learn from this to do better next time. So what's happened in terms of the response is so the Ministry of Health has assembled fairly large response teams that do things like, the core philosophy of the response is you need to find people who might have Ebola, isolate them, test them, and treat them if they're positive. So finding people requires community teams, you need isolation centers or transit centers, and you need treatment units. The problem is that this has been done and you also need to have what are called safe and dignified burials. You need to find people when they die, and you need to swab them in the mouth for Ebola. As you can imagine, this can be quite invasive. And in a setting where there's already a lot of insecurity, the response has become the people who do this work, which is very dangerous work because people have stones thrown at them all the time, get beaten up, get killed sometimes. In some places, they're accompanied by armed teams, which is kind of a necessary thing when you need to protect people who are doing their work. The problem is that it's set off a spiral of violence. Now, the other thing I should mention, which is not much discussed, but I think is relevant here, is that all these people that are part of the response, the hundreds of people or even thousands that have been deployed, are local people who have been selected through the Ministry of Health and who are paid quite a lot of money. So in a setting this poor, you can imagine that this creates some tensions. Just to come back to healthcare infrastructure, this is the operating room of one of the hospitals where we had an outbreak. This is, none of the hospitals I visited had electricity or running water in their operating rooms. So this is how dire the health conditions are. And you see all this money coming in, and Land Rovers and meetings and per diems. You can imagine people get a little bit frustrated because they say, well, what about us? What about the other diseases? So what we've seen is two kinds of violence. We've seen what I would classify on two forms. The first have been, and we saw this in Guinea as well, when I was in Guinea, we had incidents like this. So we have episodic flare-ups of resistance or caillassage, throwing of stones, when a team goes in and does something which is felt to be invasive or disrespectful. Sometimes teams go in to disinfect, and people think that they're actually spreading Ebola because they come in cosmonaut suits. So what happens, this is very interesting, there's a case of Ebola, then a bunch of guys in cosmonaut suits show up and spray stuff, and then a week later there's more cases of Ebola. So obviously they're spraying to disinfect, to prevent, but people have been contaminated before, but people are assuming causality. And in a setting where people are very mistrustful, this may make sense. The third reason for these episodic flare-ups, of course, is this context of jealousy and anger over the money not being, being captured by certain elites. But what we've seen, and what I think is very worrisome in this case, is orchestrated attacks, organized attacks, most recently last week, with dozens of heavily armed men attacking centers. So this is new. This was not seen in West Africa, even though West Africa was a much, much scarier, worse epidemic. So what's going on here? Well, I think from my time there and from ongoing discussions we're having within MSF and within, dare I say it, security circles, it's pretty clear that these orchestrated attacks are capitalizing on broader feelings of anger to score political and strategic points. So this Ebola response is symbolic of something, so it's a target. So what the strategy is and who is leading it is not clear at this stage. As you know, some attacks have been, and WHO physician was killed. This is not light, breezy stuff. So what's going on here? What is causing these attacks? Well, I should say, first of all, that we don't know at this stage. But what we do, there's a number of theories floating around, and the one that I think is, so one is that people are orchestrating these attacks to gain political advantage. From my community engagement team, and I actually quite trust what I was hearing, there was a concern that some of the attacks were being organized by the security services themselves to legitimate and increase the money flowing to them. And I think but I think the context here is really important. And what is common to all these theories is that it's about money and capturing money coming in. So here we have another perfect storm, right? You have an epidemic, you have international organizations reasonably and justifiably coming in to help, and the clinics become targets, and as a result, people don't go for healthcare anymore. And what happens when they don't go for healthcare? Well, if they have Ebola, they spread it further, and we're starting to see, as we saw in West Africa, a huge uptick in deaths from other diseases. In fact, excess malaria killed far more people, well, considerably more people in Guinea after 2014 than Ebola actually did. So, new wars and new epidemics, what we're seeing here is a vicious cycle, right? So, what we saw was that that conflicts drive antibiotic resistance with implications far beyond the theater of war, as these genes spread worldwide and transform microbial genomes into superbugs, and they also impair control of fast and deadly epidemics like Ebola. So targeting healthcare drives epidemics, but epidemics can lead to targeting of healthcare. And so this is the vicious cycle. I'm trying to put these together I'm not making an argument about causality here, but about pathways and linkages between things that we normally wouldn't look together. And I think we need to be creative and to think big for addressing the global health challenges that we're seeing today. Now, the key new variable here is that healthcare is both a target and a driver, right? It used to be outside. It used to be something, international health regulations. It used to be sort of a sanctuary. It's now part and parcel of the way war is waged and the way people defend themselves against war. And that is, I think, the key lesson here, the key ingredients. We don't have very good understanding of how healthcare systems change the kind of health dynamic when they're integrated to conflict. I just wanted to make two final linkages before I end. The phenomena of attacks on healthcare, I would like to provocatively suggest, is part of a broader global phenomena of resistance or hesitancy around healthcare, of distrust of authority. And people in the global health world are now talking about this. The one that is perhaps most in the news today is vaccine refusal or vaccine hesitancy and measles epidemics that we are seeing in California, in New York, in France. So there's something going on there. And I would argue that people who don't want to have an Ebola vaccine in DRC probably are much more rational than people who don't want a measles vaccine in New York. I think I'm trying to say there's a broader global phenomena, and it's linked, it appears to be linked in some ways to the rise of populism. And this is something we need to be very careful of. Polio is another example, polio vaccination. And of course, you all know that Osama bin Laden was identified and killed by the CIA using a polio vaccination, a decoy polio. That's how they got his DNA. They went around vaccinating. And this link with populism is interesting, and I'll end on this note, because if we think historically, healthcare has always been a binding force for the social contract. If there's a social contract, then there's healthcare. This we know from European history from the 19th century. When healthcare breaks down and the social contract breaks down, and vice versa. So I think that may be another element of the vicious cycle here. So finally, I just wanted to thank my colleagues of the War and AMR and Acinetobacter baumannii group. This is a very exciting group of absolutely wonderful friends and thinkers. Two of them who are here, Anthony Rzyk and Nina Kitterlin, are both at the Graduate Institute. And of course, the teams I've had the chance to work with at Médecins Sans Frontières in Yemen and in DRC. Thank you.
Thank you, Vinh-Kim. I didn't think we would be hearing about slimy sex today, but I feel more comfortable on the DRC side and then on the AMR side. So perhaps we could start off with the situation in the DRC. You were unfortunately in the DRC when we showed the film Survivors here, dealing with the Ebola crisis in Sierra Leone. And what we heard very clearly there, that it's because the community was able to take the situation in their hands, that we were able to fight it off rather successfully. And Joanne Liu, who is the president of MSF International, was here on the panel. And she thinks things very much like along the lines of what you said about building trust in the communities in order to be able to fight the problem. But my question to you is, how would you channel the money so that you would arrive at a situation where they feel that they're taking their lives into their own hands? We live in a community here of NGOs and the international organization, this community of health, all well-intended. How would you, if you had your pockets full of money, channel the money so as to give that where it should succeed the best?
So we would have to think about mechanisms of transparency, right? So the situation in the DRC is that people know how much people are being paid, and it's up to $600 a day, which is, you know, probably the GDP per capita. But there's no transparency in terms of who is being hired, who is being selected on what criteria. So, you know, and this is this would be a first step. The second thing that we actually wrote about this in Guinea is there has to be a mechanism to recognize that people's doléances, people's complaints, people's claims are legitimate, that they are worthy of being heard, put it that way. In Guinea, what really struck me, and in DRC this had not really changed much, is there's nobody listening. There's just a bunch of people lecturing. When I took over, when I arrived in Kaina, we had just hired a team of quote-unquote health promoters, and they had all been trained to deliver messages, but they hadn't been trained to listen to what people were worried about. So if you want to have a conversation, you need to talk and you need to listen. So listening is, it sounds very flaky, but when you can really see that this whole model we've developed is one way. It's about delivering messages and making people obey. And I didn't mention it earlier, but the most dramatic example of that is that people are being brought in forcibly at gunpoint for testing and for treatment. And MSF has documented these cases. And in one case, a young woman a woman with Ebola fled the center because she was afraid. And the police went out to her house, couldn't find her, and they just brought in her brother and basically held him hostage. So it's a cultural shift, right? That people's fears, like that people are spreading Ebola, that they shouldn't be dismissed. They should be addressed somehow.
So more anthropologists.
You don't need anthropologists to do
field.
that. You just need sensible people.
Okay, any sensible people in the room who want to ask a question? Okay, I'll start with Professor Burci and then the gentleman behind here.
To break the ice. Thank you very much. An excellent report. So, going back to what WHO is doing or is not doing, what do you think would be the right approach? Because I was in WHO during the Ebola crisis, and obviously WHO was, after the first hesitancy, experimented on the ground and probably participated in this law enforcement top-down approach to prove so unsuccessful. So I thought that some lessons had been learned. WHO was talking about hiring anthropologists, so really try to incorporate the lesson of Ebola. But evidently now we are shifting to a different environment in the DRC that we did not expect in the West Africa, and we had to experiment again. So if you were Dr. Tedros, how would you approach it?
So the challenge for WHO, of course, is that it's run by its member states, and it has to operate through the government and the Minister of Health. And it probably, from what I've seen of how WHO operates, they've had to become operational in a very short time. And they are not, it's new to them. And I think the devil is probably in the details of how you do things. And because it's new, so I'll take the example of MSF. So we kind of got screwed over in this case, in the sense, I'll give it's a detail, but which is important, is that we lost at MSF. You know what we are, we're, the humanitarians, kind of cowboys, and we build hospitals and treat people, this kind of thing, right? So in the context of this Ebola response in Equateur and here, we somehow lost the power to decide who would be admitted and who we would treat. And that became a real problem for us because people were being brought in forcibly for treatment. And I was in this situation where I felt very uncomfortable because I was keeping people locked up against their will to treat them. So the point I want to make is that MSF, because it's been doing this for a long time, generally we have a sense of what the red lines are and what we need to maintain control over. In this case, even we lost control. I don't think WHO has enough operational experience to know what the things are that they need to have control over. Perhaps, or to exercise oversight over. So what I saw is that when we were hiring people, and I'm sure the WHO is the same, you're given a list of people by the chief medical officer, the médecin chef de zone, right? It's not an open hiring process, right? And I think that's problematic. I mean, we have open hiring process. So probably there needs to be much more oversight and I mean, it sounds very bureaucratic, but I don't think it's that complicated to put into place. So it's in the details, and I think there's a very good relationship between Dr. Tedros and the minister, but the Kinshasa is very far away, and it's the low. And you know what? The other thing I saw, which was really fascinating, and this is a really fascinating thing. Every day there's a meeting where all the people involved in the response come, and every team presents the work they've done, which is extraordinary. It's a really remarkable form of social mobilization. But it really depended on who was leading the meeting. So in one district where I was, there had just been a case, and I was sent to this district, and the médecin-chef de zone, who's the chair of the meeting, it was his first meeting, and it was really interesting because the meeting ended up being about solving problems. We can't do this. But the other meetings I went to, had become a rote performance. And it was fascinating because every day, exactly the same number of contacts, 100% of them were followed up. And at one point I said, how can you follow up 100% of 572 people every day? I mean, these are villages, it's complicated. And they said, well, actually, we're just making the numbers up, because otherwise the chief will get mad at us and we won't get paid. So leadership, local leadership is huge.
Yes?
Thank you, Professor. I'm wondering what you think of the strategy to include Ebola in the regular treatment cycle and all the morbidities that occur. So you don't sort of isolate, isolation barrier techniques would be required as per other infectious diseases. So rather than stigmatize Ebola, include it with the malarias, with the typhoids. It's just something that's been posited recently and is in the media currently.
I think it's an excellent idea, because that was my idea. So no, so basically what happened after the attacks in February, it became very clear. So that hospital I showed you was next door to the thing we built for Ebola. And after 2 weeks, I went to the hospital and started to nose around, and I realized they had 2 thermometers. It was crazy. And then so what was happening actually was that the real Ebola cases, none of the people who were being brought in for testing had Ebola. They were just being brought in to meet quotas. And the real people who had Ebola were going to hospitals where there's no gloves, there's no soap, and there's no thermometers. So, and this was happening all over. So I think in January and February, there was kind of this awareness that this is what we had to do, right? Because the patients were not where the interventions were. And so what I actually did is I closed that transit center, and we took these 70 hygienists up and cleaned that hospital. That's how I discovered there were bed bugs everywhere. And people loved it. And so I think this is, to me, this is what we need to do now. And this has now become MSF's strategy. A number of us were kind of pushing for this. You know, within MSF, there was a lot of tension because there's kind of the classic approach of isolation. And it was often being pushed by people who had been through these horrific epidemics in Liberia and Guinea, where people were just dying in the street. I mean, you know, it was really, and where there was, because so many people were coming in with Ebola, there was a lot of transmission going on in the centers, because we didn't have tests back then, right? So we were mixing everybody together. We couldn't test them. But now I think there's something else, which, and this is a real credit to WHO, there's a vaccine. So the vaccine reduces enormously the risk of infection for healthcare workers. So we have a much lower grade epidemic, and we have vaccination, which means it's actually safe. And in fact, we started treating Ebola patients. I treated an Ebola patient wearing just not the cosmonaut suit, just a glove. And it makes a big difference to people because it's hard to describe, but it really does make a difference. So clearly this is the way to go, and at last word, we're kind of struggling with, MSF is struggling with the ministry, because the ministry does not agree with this approach. But personally, I think it's the way to go forward.
Yes, this gentleman, and then colleague. Yes, you.
Hi, I'm Neil. I'm a veterinary student from the United States. I've heard talk of one of the more effective approaches, or potentially ostensibly one of the more effective approaches to these sorts of situations is having a local, not a health ministry local, but an actual on-site local who's a sort of cultural ambassador for those who are, to connect the local community with those who are the medical professionals. First of all, do you have experience or do you agree with that approach? And if so, what are the most sort of successful ways to that approach that you've seen?
So this is actually where the one place where I think anthropology comes in is an added value over just being sensible. So what we saw in Guinea was there's a kind of a standard template, right? Is that it's kind of the UNICEF model. You show up and you say, where's the head of the village association? Where's the head of the women's groups? And you mobilize the people who are kind of the accredited community leaders. And this backfired. And it backfired because in Guinea, these accredited people are in fact part of the usual, part of a patronage network, which extends from the corridors of power to capture resources, right? So every village has its beltway bandits, to speak in American, in Washington speak. And this generated violence because these are the people who always get aid, and they were getting the aid and they were pilfering it. What we saw in Sierra Leone, Liberia was fascinating because and these are older, right? There's a generational thing. And in Sierra Leone and in Liberia and in Guinea, you found what happened in some communities is that the youth, the young people, organized themselves into brigades. They auto-organized, printed up T-shirts, and I have a picture in Guinea, they printed on their T-shirts staff, right? Because they were mimicking, right, as a way to try and to be recognized, to get money to do burials. But they started doing the burials on their own. I mean, I spoke to a number of people. So the problem is, how do you identify people that are credible and trusted and legitimate in a community that you don't know? And I think and so what we did in Guinea is we did ethnography. So I trained young sociology students to do ethnography and to identify my colleague Sylvain Faye, Frédéric Lemarcy and I did this, and Sylvain uses this term which makes me cringe. He calls them champions. But it really worked. And these people who were trusted in each community were very different. They weren't like a set category of people. In one neighborhood of Conakry, we just hung out and discovered that the people who were the most trusted were the ambulatory bankers, right? These are the Nigerians that walk around and you give them the money you've made selling stuff every day, and they give you back 29 days worth. So they're bank. It's a long story, but who do you trust more than somebody you're giving money to every day, especially when you're poor? And these guys we used as ambassadors. In other places, it was the soccer team coach, etc. So you can't use a one-size-fits-all approach, and that's the problem. Is it's time-consuming. But we really tried to develop an approach where we tried to understand who the people were, and that's the challenge.
Thank you very much, Professor. So when there is a new outbreak in an already war zone, such as Syria or Yemen, how can we immediately drop the prices of medication? Because that is what becomes most important. Also, whose responsibility would it be to pay for these medications? Because as we already know, these are international wars, not local wars. So what are the ways in which we can deal with the finance of medication issue?
Well, in my experience, that in the Middle East, populations are having, part of the problem is that they actually can't afford medication, in a sense, when it comes to antibiotic resistance. So the question is, so I'll take an example, which is Gaza, where we have, to try and say this very simply, we have several thousand people who have what are called need limb salvaging. They've been hit with these actually illegal. The Israelis use these bullets, which are designed to explode once they penetrate flesh. They're actually illegal under international law. So we have several thousand people who are missing more than 7 centimeters of bone. All those people will get infections, and most of them will lose their limbs. and so reconstructive surgery is kind of a slow emergency in Gaza. And what we found there is that the problem is that all kinds of antibiotics are being dumped, right, because they're about to expire. So we have this antibiotic anarchy story. So I think the question is, how do you regulate and install a kind of what we call stewardship, or some kind of systematic approach, protocol-driven approach, and then you would have to probably furnish these drugs for free, right? Because because people have money, they can afford stuff. So if they can't get it for free, they'll pay for it. But often people think that if it's free, it's no good, right? So I don't have an easy answer, but the problem seems to be, in a way, I hesitate to say this, but it's not too expensive drugs, but too many drugs. And so it's a question of, how do you provide health care in a conflict setting that's rational? What we've seen in the wake of the Syrian conflict is, or from 2012 on, is a whole kind of therapeutic economy. So for example, ICRC does reconstructive surgery, and then money flows to private hospitals to do rehab, that kind of thing. So there's a lot of money here, and I'm not sure how you can, it's massive, and I'm not sure how you can regulate it.
But just to stay on this point, do you see a role for the private sector here to make available their drugs at lower cost in situation of crisis? This is something we should try to develop up north more?
I don't know. I'm not really. It's a bit far from my. I'm just saving lives, that kind of stuff. No, it's a fairly technical. I mean, Suri Moon would know much better. What I do understand. I mean, this stuff is very. It's for really smart people, and I can't quite master it. But the problem with antibiotics is that there's no market for them, because. If you develop a new antibiotic, you want to use it as little as possible. So I know there's a lot of discussion, coming back to private sector. It's not so much the private sector, but it's the incentive structures or the pricing models that are being worked on, so that the private sector has an incentive to furnish drugs in a way that is consistent with them being used properly, right? So the idea is not to, the market now just incentivizes drug companies to make drugs that a lot of people will buy, or that are really, really expensive, so that a few rich people will buy. And that's the problem more. And I think there's a lot of exciting work done being done around how to incentivize the private sector.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yes.
Thank you. I'm Cyril Pervelak from the University of Geneva, Institute of Global Health, ex-WHO, UNAIDS. So on the new epidemics, do you think, if you look into the future and the next 5 years, is WHO, I'm coming back to my colleague's question, doing the right thing in terms of the landscape or inventory of what's happening in the countries to tackle new epidemics? Because if I listen to your presentation, and thank you for this nice presentation, I see that WHO has a classical listing or inventory of what's happening in the countries, but I don't see yet how to tackle these new epidemics with just this inventory. So what is missing there, and what's the solution? And for example, the question you mentioned in the Congo, and I don't know what happened in these countries you visited a few years ago in West Africa, the problem of water and electricity. Are we doing something with this? Is the World Bank getting on board? IMF? We had Agnes Souka here a few days ago who were telling us still this big problem we have with this. Thank you.
So I'm going to answer not in very general terms. What it seems to me has been happening in global health for the last 15, 20 years is that we respond to emergencies. So we have this we're developing this model of governance through emergencies. Bam, there's an emergency, we intervene. Some things change, we wait, bam, there's another emergency, right? And I think this is the wrong approach. I think what we need is clean water, electricity, gloves, bleach, soap, everywhere, all the time. Why? And this comes back a bit to your question, is when you build these parallel emergency systems, you underinvest in the everyday systems where the epidemics actually happen. There's kind of an epidemiological thing about a chain of transmission, right? So you can take one person and try and isolate them so they don't contaminate everyone, or you can decrease the risk of transmission between everybody, and you will, in fact, contain the epidemic, right? You'll maybe have a small outbreak. So this is what I think is clearly the way to go, because if you see, as I have, the condition of these hospitals, I mean, it's just awful. It wouldn't cost a lot of money. You just clean water, gloves, a thermometer or two. You know, this is what I just don't understand. I mean, you look at, and I could show you pictures. The amazing thing is in these centers, and this is really struck me in DRC. You have these places, I mean, literally went to villages where there's some poor guy, a nurse, sitting in an empty room. We would bring him malaria drug. I could show you, in a way, they're very noble pictures, because you see the pride and the dedication of these people who have nothing to work with. But they have written out, in every center I went to, every algorithm and every protocol has been written out and taped by hand, right? So these people know what to do, but they do not have the means to do anything. It would be very easy, and this is what mystifies me, So that would be, the whole, and this is not a criticism of WHO, they've been pushed into this, but the whole emergencies thing, to me, is the wrong way to go. Or another way to phrase it, maybe, is we have a constant global public health emergency, which is lack of just basic hygiene and healthcare in many parts of Africa, at least.
Yes, and that brings us to the end of our talk, and maybe that's where we should channel the money, clean water, soap, and the basics. But it was fantastic to see how these various challenges intermerge, and we look forward to hearing more about the research of your work, and also how the Global Center, our Global Health Center, will develop in the months to come. Thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you, and I'll be around if you have any questions.